I will. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining us for this webinar, The Search for Identity and Freedom from Expectations. I'm really looking forward to a really informative and engaging evening. As you can tell from my voice, I won't be speaking too much tonight, but we're more than happy to entertain your questions. I want to thank Michelle Boas and the Upper Dublin Education Foundation for funding and sponsoring this event, as well as the two subsequent events that'll be coming up in March and April. And now I'd like to introduce Kim Porter from Be a Part of the Conversation, who is going to be leading us in our work today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perez. Appreciate you having us. Yes, my name is Kim Porter. I'm the Executive Director of Be a Part of the Conversation. This is what we look like pre-COVID. It's not so much these days, but we're just really grateful that you are here with us. A big thank you to Upper Dublin School District. We've partnered with you in the past. We were with you in person a few years ago and really enjoyed that, but happy that we can find a way through technology to be together. And of course, as Dr. Perez said, thank you to the Upper Dublin Education Foundation for funding this program. The importance of these nonprofits that partner with school districts is vital. As an old Education Foundation employee myself years ago, I'm a big believer in it, and I love the work that Ed Foundations do, so bravo. This program is being recorded, but everything that is said in the chat or in the Q&A by all of you attending will not be recorded. So that will not be visible in the recording. The panelists will see your questions or comments. If you use the Q&A box, you can ask questions anonymously. If you use the chat, I believe it's just a bit visible to the panelists. So you're welcome to submit questions throughout the program that we will get to after you hear from each of the panelists. Please take the survey that pops up at the end of this program. It's a Survey Monkey. It's quite simple. It only takes a minute or two. It really helps us to know if this was beneficial to you, if there was something that you would have liked more of. If we have an opportunity to tell us, what you would like to hear in the future, other topics and things like that. And the follow-up page for this program is going to be on our website tomorrow morning. You'll see this recording, this PowerPoint that I'm about to present to you, but conversation.zone/identity is where you can find this information tomorrow. So lots of supportive information related to tonight's topic. Bob Lamb is with us. He works with me. He's our Director of Operations and Programs. So he'll be sharing some links in the chat that you can find, to help you get to these pages, like the identity page. As Dr. Perez said, we have a couple of programs coming up with Upper Dublin. The next one is on March 28th. We'll be talking about the tech-life balance and that huge challenge that it is these days. Technology is our friend. We're here together thanks to that. But we know for kids, it can be really challenging to kind of moderate this, and where is the line from, oh, I have to be online, to do I have to be online all the time? So we'll be talking about that on March 28th on Zoom. The irony. And we'll be talking about isolation, the new drug of choice. We were talking about this before COVID, and it's really, the dynamic has changed even more post-COVID or in this COVID world. So join us on April 18th for that program. That'll also be on Zoom. So I hope you'll join us then. All of our programs that are coming up are on our calendar, on our website, conversation.zone/calendar. Lots of great things coming up. Montgomery County is a frequent partner of ours. They fund many of our programs. So we have a program next week about alcohol specifically, alcohol not just among young people, but really in the general culture of our country. So our culture's drug of choice is still alcohol. It is the #1 substance that may not have an immediate deleterious effect, but certainly over time can absolutely take the best of us down. So please join us for that as well. That's a week from tonight, next Thursday. And I always like to remind folks that, by the way, I'm the parent of somebody who is in recovery. That's how I got into this work. I don't know what I would have done 12 years ago when my son went off to treatment without these support group meetings. They changed my life. They were frankly the impetus for this organization getting started. And so I hope you'll visit this page if you need any support as parent, caregiver, guardian. This part of that page has a calendar of all the meetings that are taking place. Currently, most of them are on Zoom, but you can see the green buttons are all Zoom, purple buttons are in person, and there's one that's hybrid. But any of these that you click on, the information will pop up and you'll get the details about how to join these meetings. So we're going to have a few people with us after I do my opening presentation. We'll have Dr. Lee David Elliott Cray. Her pronouns are she and they. She's the director of LGBTQIA+ programming with Charlie Health. I'm anxious for you all to meet her. And then after Dr. Cray, we'll have Damien Hallbrook, who is a person in recovery. He's a local fella. Lee is from Texas, and Damien is local here. He'll be telling you a little bit of his story and how it relates to tonight's topic. And we are always so grateful for people in recovery who are so transparent and share their story. It helps tremendously for folks to understand this from a humanistic perspective. Thank you again to Upper Dublin, Dr. Perez, who's here with us. And as she mentioned, Michelle Boas is also with us this evening, but she is just a great resource for the district as part of the Education Foundation. So these are the kinds of areas of identity that we're going to be focusing on this evening. We were just chatting before we got started. There are so many ways to dive into identity and what that means for a young person or even an adult. But these are the subjects that we want to focus on because they relate to potential risk for substance use. And they're all based on evidence that we know that there can be some risk factors that I'll be describing. And we're going to just start with perfectionism and that high achiever. So this is someone who is just maybe a little bit competitive. Maybe it's just self-imposed. It's not even an adult or a parent or guardian saying you need to be better or you need to do well. But it's and my daughter falls in this category. She absolutely is a high achiever. And we used to say to her, get a C just to find out you'll survive, but she couldn't do it. And it can be really debilitating for some folks. So, some of the things that kind of come up for somebody who has some of these traits, you can see here, like self-critical. I'm sure this resonates for some folks. I know that we've had students who, they're trying to go for the world record of how many AP classes they can take, right? So what happens to that young person when they're out in the world? They get into their reach school perhaps, and now they're with everybody else who is at the top of their class. And then that kind of fall from grace that like, I'm not the perfect person. We know that substance use, especially anything that sort of takes them out of their anxiety and stress, but also things that they may feel will enhance their studying capabilities, like Adderall, Vyvanse, medications that are used for ADHD. Even if they don't have ADHD, they might be getting their hands on some of these medications that are amphetamines and they are addictive. So we often hear Adderall described as the college, it is the study drug in college years, but certainly we know that this can happen in high school years as well. Unfortunately, it flies under the radar for a while until things kind of start to fall apart a bit, until it becomes obvious. So let's talk about the LGBTQ2I+ population. And just to break down what those initials mean, there are a lot of initials in there, right? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, and pansexual are all referring to sexual orientation, whereas transgender and intersex are about gender identity. And then there are others that can talk about, orientations or identities, both. And to break this down a little bit further, here are the definitions of, or some definitions of sexual orientation as opposed to gender identity. And again, this slide deck is going to be available on that follow-up page. So you don't have to take screenshots. It'll all be available for you. So when we think about gender norms, being LGBTQ2IA+, is not in and of itself a risk factor for substance use, but here are some just gender norms that we may have grown up with. These are probably more my generation or even a little bit younger than me, but we grow up with this. So if these are some of the parents whose kids are expressing some questions that they have about their own gender, whether it's their identity or their the way they identify, then it kind of can be a complication for family members. So, but we really want to be careful about shaming language, because these are the things that might lead to substance use, right? So when somebody identifies in one of these ways when they're a young person, that might feel threatening to another student. It might feel like scary to them or confusing, and then they might act out in a way that's shaming to the person who's identified this way. So this is part of what's called minority stress, and we just want to be very aware of this and sensitive to it. We do know from research that adolescents among these populations are more likely to binge drink, use cannabis, engage in IV substance use, or use cocaine more so than their non-LGBTQ2I+ peers. So looking generationally, I think it's very interesting. I think it's very good news to see that we're getting folks who understand these differences a lot more. So looking at the different generations, Gen Zers who are currently 9 to 24 years old, so they're the ones who are attending Upper Dublin right now, they are more likely to know someone using gender neutral pronouns. So you can see that Gen Z is here. Their parents are probably down here in Gen X, so roughly. And so you can see that's what we call a generation gap, right? So maybe there's some difference in understanding, knowing, and recognizing that people that they care about identifying this way. And here's another piece of this study that looked at people who believed that forms should include pronouns other than man, or I'm sorry, profiles, gender profiles other than man or woman. So you can see the shift here, again, generationally. And also just looking at a 4-year period, look at the difference in the number of 15 to 17-year-olds who said that they identified as non-heterosexual. So I think this is very good news that young people are feeling more at more liberty to express themselves and be honest about this. I can't wait to see what these numbers look like in the future. But obviously there must be more acceptance. We can make that assumption, I hope, if they're feeling somewhat more comfortable, but I do believe we have a long way to go here. I'm sure you're going to hear more about this later. Okay, athletes. Being athletic, being in any extracurricular activity can absolutely be a protective factor, meaning that these students might be less likely to use substances or engage in other risky behaviors. But think about some of the traits of someone who is an athlete. They might be risk takers. They may feel like they're invincible. They might like a thrill. They might like a challenge. And then there are pure norms. So, being with other people who engage in substance use and feeling like I want to fit in. Who doesn't want to fit in when they're a kid? And I think that rather than peer pressure, we talk more these days about peer presence, just being around your peers, wanting to be reflective of what you're seeing around you. And it's also very validating to be with other people who are using substances. So it sort of gives you a little bit of carte blanche to continue using. Other factors that affect athletes might be the pressure to feel the best, to feel like you're living up to everyone's expectations. There's those demanding schedules. It puts a lot of stress on academics in some cases. There might be a desire to enhance performance. Steroids is something that we don't see too much in adolescents, but it certainly has the potential, especially as they mature, to become problematic. And then injuries. Now if you've had an injury, you've lost your natural high potentially. Like maybe this is the thing that lights you up, and now you don't have that activity any longer. That puts you at risk. And then, of course, there's the potential for being prescribed a painkiller. I think by now, let's hope we've all heard the red flags around opioids, such as Percocet and Vicodin and OxyContin, but it still is a risk if someone needs surgery or has some really, really horrible acute pain. They may be prescribed these highly addictive medications. Not everyone who takes an opioid is going to become addicted or move on to heroin, but far too many do. And it's definitely something we need to be very, very conscious of. And concussion can be a real challenge as far as putting us at risk for a substance use disorder. We know that we're up to 4 times more likely to have problems with drugs and alcohol if we've had a concussion. So again, here's just some research telling us that athletes, adolescent athletes in particular, may be more susceptible to these kinds of substance use related behaviors. And they point out particularly ice hockey, football, lacrosse, wrestling. I won't worry too much about these details, just to know that it is a potential, something just to be aware of. When we talk about survivors, we're talking about people who have had either a diagnosis of a mental health challenge or they've experienced some PTSD, some trauma. They might have a physical disability, a learning difference. There might be environmental stresses. There may be grief and loss. We've lost so many people to COVID. I'm sure many of our families have been impacted by that. So that's who we're talking about when we talk about survivors. So that's a lot of that's about mental health. And just a couple of terms I want to make you aware of. Comorbidity is talking about when there's more than one disorder that's been identified. So there may be some things that are happening concurrently. A dual diagnosis is a similar term, but this is referring more specifically to having a mental health challenge and a substance use challenge. So this is where it gets complicated when you're not sure if what you're seeing is the substance use or the mental health problem, and which came first. Is it that someone is self-medicating because they haven't been diagnosed or treated for some mental health challenge? Or is it that they've been experimenting with substances and now that behavior is mimicking a mental health challenge? So it can be complicated, but we do know that it's important to treat them simultaneously. So if they are at a point that they need some sort of inpatient or outpatient treatment, that whole presentation needs to be addressed and needs to be treated. More than 60% of adolescents in treatment programs meet the criteria for another mental health challenge. So this is not unusual, and it's not surprising among young people. Obviously, this is a tumultuous time of life. I was talking recently with this gentleman who is the chief clinical officer at Caron Treatment Center, which is a very large inpatient facility here in Pennsylvania. And they have adolescent and young adult patients all the way through senior citizens. But we were talking about cannabis, and I wanted to bring this up because we're talking about dual diagnosis right now. Cannabis is very tricky because it's presenting in very disconcerting ways in young people who are using it for anxiety. And what Dave Rittenberg told me was that of their young adult and adolescent patients, meaning all those under the age of 25, 45% of them are identifying cannabis as either their primary or secondary substance that they're using. And 90% of those populations identify cannabis among the substances that they're using. They've also, and this is particularly important for this topic, they've recently seen a 10 to 15% increase in hospitalization for cannabis-induced psychosis. This is not an old wives' tale. This is a real thing that we are hearing far too often. I could spend hours talking about cannabis and young people. We actually have a program specifically about this that I can direct you to if you're interested in more information there. I think this is so important, especially again for our young people. I'll also tell you that my daughter she has a couple of mental health diagnoses, and one of them is Tourette syndrome, which was very evident when she was in middle school, which is what a horrible time in your life to have a disorder that involves tics and vocalizations that can be very embarrassing. They were for her. And she, middle school's a tough time, and she had some kids picking on her and bullying her. When she got to high school, she really advocated for herself and helped her peers to understand what was happening with her by explaining it. The reason I bring her up when we're on this slide is she kind of became her diagnosis, which really was troubling to her dad and me. And we had some really, I think, helpful conversations. I hope they were helpful. She's 30 now and she's managed this beautifully. But at the time, we had to have this talk about, you're more than your diagnosis. You don't need to wear your Tourette syndrome like a pass. Like, you have to tell people about it all the time, that this is why I'm this way. You will be accepted for who you are, not because you have this diagnosis. But it can be tricky. It can be very challenging. We want to recognize it, but we don't want it to consume our identity. And, this happens to a lot of us when we're young, right? We get labeled. I was labeled shy. Many of my friends today would be shocked to know that, but I was labeled as shy. And so if I was ever in a situation with my extended family where I was not shy, they really kind of made fun of me about it. So, if you tell somebody they're gorgeous all the time, what happens when they aren't feeling very gorgeous? If they're the class clown, is that something they have to live up to? And I think especially this word smart is a little bit tricky. And I love this study that was done by Carol Dweck, who's now at Stanford. This was before that, when she was at Columbia, I believe. She did a study with fifth graders, and she had two groups of fifth graders that each took the same test. It was a very simple test. She told group A, you must be really smart. You did so well on this test. She told group B, you must have worked really hard. You did so well on this test. And then she gave both groups an opportunity to take the test again. Group A said, and it was optional, by the way, Group A said, nope, I'm good. I got my label of being smart. I'm not going to risk losing that. Group B said, okay, I'll take the test again. So we really want to encourage our kids through the language of recognizing the effort, right? And recognizing the challenge rather than you are smart, because boy, what a lot of pressure that puts on our kids, right? Oh, social media, friend or foe, right? Kids have smartphones for sure, and they are on major platforms for sure. We need social media for a lot of good things. This is a way for kids to feel accepted, to celebrate their identities, but it can be challenging as well. So there are two different studies that are kind of reflected here. The bars are showing the most used platforms, YouTube being the most frequently used. But when there was this other study that was done that just asked them about their favorite platforms, and for some reason they didn't include YouTube. So we know that Snapchat is identified as their most favorite platform, followed by TikTok, Instagram, and then trailing far behind are Twitter and Facebook. Again, these are for teens. So not too surprising here, but Instagram, which is, as we all know now, is owned by Facebook, and was very much aware that young people in particular were feeling very challenged and having a lot of anxiety and depression and low self-esteem. And didn't they go and double down on that and kind of exploit it? And we know now from a lot of journalism that was done that we know that they kind of got called out on this. And so hopefully kids are being a little bit more wary about the way that social media can take them down that rabbit hole of feeling like they are branding themselves, right? They're like their own little marketing campaign for who they are, what group they belong to, how popular they are. And I just found these so interesting. There were two surveys done asking young people what they wanted to do when they were outside after high school years. And boy, some of these career choices were definitely not on lists that I can recall. So I just find this very, very interesting. And I would love to hear from Dr. Cray, particularly what she feels about some of these things. But it's really, really interesting the way social media has guided folks in a very different direction in some ways. So I know we have a lot of adults with us tonight. You might be a parent, guardian, teacher, coach, mentor, just someone who advocates for young people. As always, connection is everything, right? And talking about things that aren't heavy is also a good idea. Being light, especially as our kids get into adolescence, it can be really nice to just let go of all the heavy discussions that we need to have and really have some fun together, relax together, and take some opportunities to model for our kids some healthy habits. And when we talk about, when we have an alcohol program, we're going to tell you, please try to think about how you talk about alcohol, that it's not the thing that takes you out of your stress. So in this case, what we're advocating for is to say, I am so stressed. I had such a terrible day. I'm going to go take a walk. Do you want to come with me? What a great habit to model for our kids. If we've taken on too much, we can express that we need to be kind to ourselves. And I love this too. If we, as adults, own up, be accountable for any mistakes that we've made. Maybe we acted unfairly with a friend or a spouse or one of our kids, or maybe we posted something on social media that we regret now. And when our kids see us apologizing for our mistakes becomes normal. And when they see us make amends, they learn that it's normal to be accountable for our behavior and to learn from our mistakes. So teaching our kids about perspective as well, what seems like the end of the world today is going to probably be very unimportant, even tomorrow, certainly 5 years from now. So as a parent, I understand how hard it is to see our kids in pain, to see them feel challenged, see them feel hurt. And so we, of course, want to get in and smooth out all those challenges, right? But who of us didn't benefit from the challenges in our life? That's where our personal growth comes from. And as hard as it is, if we're not willing to see them fail, we're not willing to see them learn. They've got to feel that pain a little bit, And I love this. I'm just sharing this because it was one of the favorite things I heard in parent support groups over the years. A dad was expressing his regret for kind of living vicariously through his son. He said, I was playing my movie on my son's screen. And, we all have hopes and dreams for our kids. It's natural for us to be influenced by our own stories. That's really all we can bring to the table is what we remember. But if it worked for us to be involved in school activities, doesn't mean it's going to work for our kid necessarily. They're an entirely different individual. They have their own identity. They have their own dreams and hopes. Very, very slippery slope for us to fall down that road of wanting them to meet our expectations or fulfill our dreams. And finally, if we are struggling with our child's identity, we might need to go and talk to a professional just to get support for ourselves. This is challenging. It can be a little tricky. So, encourage all of us to do this. And it's also not a bad idea to show our kids how to ask for help, because someday they're not going to be under our roof and they're going to need to make that phone call themselves if they need the support as well, whether they're in college looking for student assistance of some kind, counseling centers and so on. It's so important to do this. All right, that is the end of my slide deck. I am now happy to introduce you to Dr. Cray, and I'm going to quickly read you her bio. Dr. Lee David Elliott Cray, PhD, her pronouns are she and they. She's the director of the LGBTQIA+ programming at Charlie Health and is co-director of the Mind Body Ecology Institute. She's a trauma-informed yoga instructor, as well as a certified philosophical consultant, mindfulness coach, and sexuality counselor. She regularly offers classes such as trans yoga and queer mindfulness for members of the LGBTQIA+ communities. Dr. Cray, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim. And thanks for that wonderful presentation. Thanks to all the other organizers and participants. And thanks to everyone in attendance. I mean, what a great way to spend some time together. Yeah, so I related to so much of what you talked about, Kim, not just in the LGBTQIA+ section, but all throughout. So what I'd like to do is just take a few minutes to kind of walk you through some of the major beats of my own story, and in the process, explain some ways of thinking about identity, some approaches to LGBTQIA plus concepts, some reframes that might end up being, that I've seen be for lots of people pretty powerful. Right? So to start, again, my name is Lee. My pronouns are she and they. What I like to tell people, my cutesy little saying, is that she is right and they isn't wrong. Yeah. I live in Texas, where it's currently very cold. It's 28 degrees. I walked my dogs this morning and they all fell down because everything is a sheet of ice. But I am actually from Pennsylvania. I grew up in central PA, about 20 minutes away from Bucknell University, about 20 minutes away from Susquehanna University, about 45 minutes away from State College. I did my undergraduate at IUP. I lived a pretty uneventful childhood. Aside from the fact that I was a little girl who no one told she was a little girl. I spent my childhood mistakenly thinking I was a boy, and whew, what a boy I was. Oh my goodness. But I see a lot of my stuff, a lot of my story in what Kim shared. So a few other aspects of my identity. So I am transgender. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I can't really tell you anything more specific than that. Am I a trans woman? Am I a non-binary trans feminine person? I don't know. I don't think there's actually an answer to that question. Not yet, at least. Maybe there will be soon. I do identify as asexual and aromantic. And just as a note, this is the 5th day of Aromantic Spectrum Awareness Week. So if you don't know what that means, there's lots of material out there, especially this week, for the purpose of awareness. I am 1,014 days sober as of today, which definitely relates to my story of figuring out my gender identity. And I'm also a person in remission from borderline personality disorder. So those are some of the aspects of myself that I saw scattered throughout Kim's presentation so far, and they'll all be beats on the story I'm about to tell. So I was born. I spent some time as a child, but it wasn't very interesting. I basically just sat in my room and played Dungeons and Dragons by myself, and Super Mario and Mortal Kombat and all of that sort of stuff. I lived very rurally. I had a pet donkey. Spent a lot of time just wandering in the woods. My dad would try to take me to go hunting, and I would just sit on the tree stand and play with my Magic the Gathering cards. Yeah, that's pretty much my childhood. Got to college, was a excellent student, excelled, graduated from IUP with my degree in philosophy. Then went to Ohio State University for my graduate degree, also in philosophy. And it was there that I had my first drink of alcohol. Yeah, it was at Larry's Bar on High Street. Someone gave me a Guinness, and I was like, "This is magic." Right? And at that point, I was stressed from grad school, stressed from living in a city for the first time in my life, stressed from new social environment, leaving all my people behind, being away from my family for the first time, and that alcohol became my best friend. As it did for many people in my graduate program. Right. Far more people than not, right? And it was kind of the norm. It was the idea that if you were going to go out after seminar with your professors and keep reaping the benefits of their amazing intellects, you had to go drink with them. So it was very much normalized. Right? But I always had this unidentified stress all throughout grad school, and I didn't know where it was coming from. I was in and out of therapy. I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and then eventually borderline personality disorder. And yeah, there was a lot going on, and I would tell more of that part of the story, but I don't remember much of it, to tell you the truth. A lot of it is a blur. And given the mix of the borderline flare-ups and the alcohol, I don't remember a lot of grad school. It's kind of a big undifferentiated cloud. But eventually I ended up in Michigan, where I was teaching at Grand Valley State University. And it was around 2012, 2013. And I first heard the term non-binary. And I was like, what does that mean? And I looked into it and I was like, oh, hey, not man or woman? That feels like me. And it felt like something I had tried to articulate to my friends for a long time, but didn't have the language for. it's something I couldn't discover in myself yet because I didn't have the vocabulary. And since I didn't have the vocabulary, I didn't have the concept. And without the concept, I had no way to process the experience. Remember one night I was out at Mac's Bar in Grand Rapids with one of my colleagues who was a feminist philosopher, and we were many drinks in, and I asked, how do you know if you're trans? Like, how do you know? And the conversation did not go well. Because presenting as a cisgender, heterosexual white man at the time, she read my comment as questioning the validity of trans persons' self-determination and the believability of their testimony, right? Instead of hearing me ask, how do I know? She was hearing me ask, well, how do they know? That conversation had a lot of tears, a lot of argument, not much follow-up conversation. We didn't speak again for 8 years until she wrote to me on Facebook to apologize. But I went very back deep into a closet at that point, and I did not think or talk about this for a very, very long time. Fast forward a little bit, I'm living in Texas now, teaching at Texas Christian University, and I'm teaching a lot of gender studies, lots and lots of it. This stuff is on my mind, and when I teach something, I live it. It's kind of like how you get into the material, you make it your world, and everything. I was just thinking about gender, and it just got me into this self-analysis where I'd lay awake every night and ask, like, am I trans? Am I trans? I put off a lot of that thought by going out and drinking, and I would drink with people who I didn't like just so I'd have someone to drink with, and we didn't have anything in common. So we would just sit at the bar and, well, when we don't have anything in common, what do we talk about? Common denominators, we complain. So I was spending every night complaining at the bar with people I didn't like, right? Well, eventually I decided I need to pick myself up and I needed to really turn things around. So I reactivated my yoga practice, and I marched on down to the yoga studio just a few blocks from my apartment. And I signed up for a class, and I was like, I'm going to get myself back in order. And it was a fantastic class. The person who taught that class is actually now one of my colleagues at Charlie Health. It's an amazing coincidence. Not even a coincidence. It's part of the story. But so I eventually decided to become a yoga teacher. And that yoga teacher training, 200 hours, was very intense. Right? And we had to do a yoga project. And my yoga project, the mentor wouldn't tell us what that meant. It's like, you have to figure out what a yoga project is, and then you do it. Mine ended up being like finding sobriety, right? Which gave me clarity of mind. But that clarity of mind was quickly disrupted by some physical trauma. A brown recluse crawled into my bed and bit me 3 times. That'll mess you up, y'all. That hurt. And it made me completely disconnected from my body. To use like a, maybe flowery language, it just pulled me right out of my body completely. But I love that spider. That's why I have it tattooed on my arm right next to one of the scars, because that was a perfect timing. I had the clarity from the sobriety for the first time in years. In 15 years, I was thinking clearly. I was doing the yoga deep study. It was this time to mindfully reconnect with my body and sort of really, really figure out who I am as a physical being and a spiritual being. And having my spiritual being pulled out of the physical being let me reconnect to it in exactly my way, mindfully, clearly. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm trans. And that was the clarity I needed. Immediately, I was like, I gotta start teaching yoga for trans people. So I did. And then my old yoga teacher called me up. It's like, hey, I'm working for this great company called Charlie Health. We need someone who works with trans populations. You wanna chat? And I was like, yeah, I do. And that's how I got to where I am now. But I'd love to tell you a little bit about what I mean when I say that I'm trans, right? Because there's like a clinical definition, and then we can go a little bit deeper and we'll learn a little bit about labels in the process. So the word trans just means that your gender does not align entirely and completely, exclusively with the gender you were assigned at birth. Right? So in one sense, the bar for being trans is very low. I'm not saying being trans is easy, because it's not, but it's pretty easy to qualify. All you need is for your gender identity, which Kim, offered a definition of earlier. to not align completely, entirely, exclusively with your gender assigned at birth. And I knew that mine didn't. What does that mean, though? Well, I see gender identity as a way that we move through the world. Right? It's a way we relate to norms. It's a way that we relate to expectations around us. It's like a social map, whether we choose to adhere to the map or not. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna start calling myself trans. I'm gonna start following my real map. And I just started to feel better. I started to feel really good. I started to feel like myself for the very first time. I started thinking, what does this mean? And I like to think of people as stories, right? Not just as storytellers, but as stories themselves. Right? Our lives are a series of events that we impose cause and effect structure on and then derive meaning from. We create narratives. Those are our lives. And I see labels like trans or non-binary or any of these other labels under the LGBTQ2IA plus alphabet. They're like plot devices. They're narrative devices. They're lenses through which we look at our story to help us interpret our past, navigate our present, project into the future, and then synthesize all three to derive meaning. And sometimes it takes a good bit of experimentation and a good bit of trial and error to figure out what plot device, what label, if you will, works the best. So when I'm working with kids, adolescents, I work with kids ages 12 all the way up to 30, right? And they're like, what am I really? It's like they're looking inside to try to find a label on their soul that says, I'm trans, or I'm gay, or I'm non-binary, or I'm straight, or I'm asexual. And I always encourage, we can think of this as a creation rather than a discovery. What is the label that helps you navigate your present, interpret your past, project into the future, and synthesize all three into meaning? When you find the label that does that, that's your label. And that label is a tool for you. You are not in service of that label. You do not need to conform to that label. That label is not a box that you're putting yourself in, but it's a device that you use to help understand and communicate to yourself and to others. So I love to think of labels as plot devices. You might think, well, so you're just making up plot devices, making up labels? Well, yeah. One thing to acknowledge is that all this stuff is made up. Notion of gender as applied to humans, as separable from sex, is relatively new, just in the last couple of decades, 5-6 decades, I should say. The word heterosexual wasn't coined until 1869, and it was an insult. Right? And then we start dividing people up into social demographics of sexual orientation. After that, it's all relatively recent. And when we look in other cultures, other times, we see huge amount of sexual and gender diversity. Right now, we're working with the language that we have, and this proliferation of labels that we've seen over the last generation, just people realizing, hey, we don't have the concepts to adequately describe our experiences. Let's make them so that we can start really living and really, really living our stories and telling our stories. I'll wind down in just a moment here so that I can make sure that we stay on time. But I want to briefly mention another aspect of my identity. So in addition to all those other things I mentioned, in recovery, remission for borderline, trans, woman, or a non-binary person, I don't know, my story hasn't required me to figure that part out yet with that level of specificity. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But another aspect of my identity is I'm left-handed. Right? Now, here's the thing about being left-handed. When you go back in time to, say, the early 20th century, almost no one identified as left-handed. Like 2% of the population. But then you start to see this steady rise until about 1960, when it plateaus off at about 16%. And you can just imagine people at that time saying, oh, all these left-handed people, it's such a trend. It's so trendy to be left-handed. Look at how everyone's left-handed these days. Well, it's like, no, it's not a trend. It's just that we stopped hitting them on the wrists and correcting their behavior. Right? We made the world safe for left-handed people. But there's still a lot of work to be done, because when you look at our language, that anti-left-handed bias is baked into everything. The word ambidextrous means 2 right hands. The word sinister means left-handed, right? And on top of that, as a left-handed person, if there are any of you out there who are left-handed, we live in a right-handed's world. You try to write, you get stuff all over your hand, right? You try to write on a chalkboard, you get covered in chalk. The little swipey things for your cards, those are designed for right-handed people. Right? Go into a classroom and honestly try to find a left-handed desk, or try to find as many as there are supposed to be. You won't, right? And right-handed people might not notice this, because they don't see the world through those lenses. But a left-handed person does. I would explain the analogy, but I don't know. I hope it's pretty clear. Left-handed people are like queer folk. There we go. Yeah. But yeah, so that's a little bit of my story woven in with just some ideas about identity, labels, selves as narratives, identities as plot devices, exploration as figuring out how best to tell your story. And, telling our stories, yeah, they're fiction, they're all made up, but so's money, so is everything else in our world that isn't, completely natural. So thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer some more questions later on, but now will I pass it back to Kim?
Oh, sure. I'll introduce Damien, but thank you, Lee. I love the left-handed analogy. It's fabulous. Just
Thank
perfect.
you so much.
Thank you very, very much. Yeah, we'll get back to Dr. Craig with questions in just a moment. All right. So Damien Hallbrook grew up in Lansdowne, and he's got a great sense of humor, by the way. After 4 terrifying years in an all-boys Catholic high school, he attended Temple University for journalism. Upon graduating, he was hired by National Entertainment Magazine, where he's currently a senior writer and columnist. He's moderated celebrity panels on both coasts. He's co-hosted a podcast and appeared on several TV talk shows, but he's most proud of training his Chihuahua Bud to expect treats and belly scratches around the clock. He now lives in Haverford and has been sober since November 2nd. Oh, there he is. Hi, Bud. Since November 2nd, 1997. That's a lot of sobriety. Wow. Thank you, Damien, for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and Bud. He was not happy. I just woke him up from one of his 11 naps of the day. But whenever he's called out, I have to bring him. Thank you so much. And Dr. Cray, that was amazing. I feel so bad now that I'm a right-handed cisgendered gay guy. I'm just, I'm garden variety. And the only initials after my name are usually just SOB. This has been fascinating because it made me, it takes me back to all the identities that you accumulate over your life. And I started to think, so I started off as whenever I tell my story about my sobriety, I always start with I grew up gay, fat, and alcoholic. So I was a triple winner. But I started off as I was a son, and I was a little brother. And then I was a student, and then an altar boy. And then, and I was never a Boy Scout, not a big joiner. And then somewhere along the line, I realized that there was another identity there that I wasn't ready to put a name to. This was the late 70s, early 80s, where, I was about 10 or 11. And, being gay at that time was still presented as you were the tragic character, you were the deviant. And then AIDS happened. And so now, as I'm maturing and I'm going to an all-boys Catholic high school, and I was raised Catholic, there's the church talking about how gays are going to hell. There's the government saying nothing about AIDS, and we're dying, by the scores. So I grew up in this environment where this identity that I was not ready to put a name to was to a lot of people the scariest one. And then I went to this high school, and the students were not afraid to give me that identity and put names to it, and they became very creative in the various versions of the identity that I was then. It was thrust upon me before I was ready to own it. And then there's that internal battle of, I'm still a son, I'm still a student, I'm still a brother. I'm also gay, and I can't say this, but everyone else is telling me it, and it's a bad thing. Um, and I hadn't figured out, I didn't have the coping mechanisms because I was also a good boy. Like I was a good kid. I did everything right. I followed my parents' directions. I adhered to curfews. Like I was told you don't drink, so I didn't drink. I was told you don't smoke, I didn't smoke. And then, you get to that crucible moment where you do. And I started to drink um, almost apprehensively, but much like Dr. Gray, maybe a decade before you started, like in grad school, when I picked up alcohol for the first time, I was happy if somebody wanted to call me a drunk. I was happy because it was a safer identity. It was a more entertaining identity. It wasn't really condemned by 16-year-olds because if you can hold your alcohol, you're a champion. So all of a sudden I had something that if I was gay, but if I was more drunk, like they might forget this and allow me to exist because of this. So drinking became my personality, and it became my identity. And when I allowed that to happen, all of my other identities were chipped away. Suddenly I wasn't a good kid. I wasn't a good son. I wasn't a good brother. I wasn't a good student. And I definitely wasn't a good gay. I was closeted and angry and judgmental. And, if somebody, like I was self-loathing homophobia at 16. And that's not a great identity. When I finally came out at 26, I had tried on every other identity you could possibly imagine. I had become a writer. I was going to be a boyfriend. That was hilarious. I was a rebel. I was a punk. I was a goth. I was, like a druggie. Like all of these things. And it's funny because like the goth, the rebel, the punk, like none of that really stuck, but the druggie and the alcoholic, they stick. So like when someone says like, oh, it's just a phase, blue hair is a phase. So when I finally owned my gayness, I was still a raging alcoholic, and I came out to friends and family, and I had an older brother who was also gay, which helped, but he wasn't a great role model for me at the time because he was doing everything right. He wasn't a fall down drunk. He wasn't using alcohol and drugs to escape his reality and to change his identity. He was actually, as the kids would say today, living his best life. I was living a shelled out hovel of a life. And then so my friends all said, you'll be so much happier now that you're out. You're going to be so much happier. I got worse because I just started drinking more. It was all the fear, all the shame that I'd been living with, all of the pressure that had been put on me by church and government and never my family. My parents were amazing. Like this is the craziest thing. My dad is a Southern ex-military former minor league baseball player. And he never once asked me if I knew, like, had a girlfriend. So it was never the home. It was my environment outside of the home, which was school, and it was the playground, and it was the peers, the friends that I thought were friends because they weren't the ones physically beating me up at school. Like the guys at my school who were physically assaulting me, that would drop books in class so they could lean over closer to my desk and whisper a death threat. Those were, those were the macroaggressions, but the microaggressions that I lived with were accepting friendships and relationships that were just like tolerating me. So I came out, I drank and mixed everything I could possibly get into the ingredients, again for another 2 years. And then everything fell apart. I found my way into sobriety. And then again, I had to take on a new identity, which was alcoholic. And much like what Dr. Cray was saying, like I asked somebody, how do you know when you're an alcoholic? And mercifully, they responded the way I needed them to respond, which was, they talked me through, do you think you're an alcoholic? And I wanted them to tell me that I had mental illness, that I had personality disorder, that I could be medicated away from this disease. And it wasn't the case. I was a down to the DNA alcoholic. So when I got sober, it took me 3 years to come out again in sobriety. Like I wasn't passing. Like I wasn't going to like meetings and becoming friends with people and any of them thinking like, oh, this guy is straight. But I wasn't saying it because I was still living in that world of fear that had been impressed upon me for like decades in the school system. So when I finally did that, it was almost like these two identities were able to kind of come together in this beautiful harmony now that I am, yeah, these are two massive parts of who I am. And once I accepted both of them, all the other things that I had given up to drugs and alcohol slowly started to come back. I started to become that great son, that great brother, that fun coworker, that reliable friend. But it was forever. It took forever to sort through every identity that I took on for myself and the identities that were kind of thrust upon me to find out who I truly was. And I didn't do it until I was like in my 30s almost. Like I got sober at 28 and I wouldn't say that I really found who I was or started to like who I was until well into my 30s. And I look at kids now and it's really amazing, that kids in middle schools, in elementary schools are figuring out their identities, that are finding the pronouns that fit them, that they're finding, and not just that, and Dr. Crane mentioned, like, the idea of advocating for yourself was never a concept when I was a kid, or in high school, or college. Like, nobody spoke like that. And for kids now to not only have that language available to them, but also the resources that were never, in place. It's so, the old me would be so angry that these kids get it and I don't. But now I'm just so grateful because I have friends now who have kids in these age ranges that you showed us on those slides, Kim, sorry, that, they've got kids that are identifying as non-binary, that are figuring out themselves. And it's been really amazing to know that that these things are in place and that, yes, the abuses will still go on. Kids are going to be kids. I never want to say like, it's fine. Kids have to go through this. Like I wouldn't wish this on my worst nightmare, the childhood, the high school experience that I had, but that they have the chance to be more honest with their families, that they can seek resources online, that they can do things like be a part of the conversation and find that outlet and find that relief that I was looking for in a bottle for so long. And it is amazing. I had a conversation with a friend today. It's really, it's crazy that we're doing this today. I have a buddy of mine, classic, like, I mean, he's like this straight dude. He was kind of a dog in high school. He, met this woman. They settled down. Bye-bye. He's got 3 kids. Oldest son, gay. Twin daughters. One is identifying as non-binary. The other one thinks she might be bisexual. And I had a conversation with him today about the fact that it was amazing that he and his wife never made it a thing, They never like called and they were like, our kids are going through this. What should we do? They knew what to do. They had the resources, and they also knew, like, just love them, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on right now in Texas and Florida as far as bills that are being passed. And so I reached out to him and I was like, hey, your kids might be a little off right now if they're doing social media and they're seeing this stuff, because it's scary. It scares me, and I'm 52. I couldn't imagine being 16, 17, 15 and seeing this. And so I was like, hey, like, just checking in on your kids, like, just realize, like, they might be in a place that is a little weird. And he came back, he's like, you know what, it's actually really weird. We had this conversation with the kids today about what they're seeing online and what, like, how this is, this is something that we have to be, aware of, but they're safe. They never have to worry about that in our house and all. And it was just so cool. So it is, as much as I could play the victim to what these identities I endured, I could play the victim to that, or I could say, like, it did make me who I am today. It helped me find sobriety, which has helped me find so many amazing people and such an amazing life and this dog. But also that things are changing. Things are changing slowly, but they're changing beautifully. And, when I see, like, if Dr. Cray existed when I was 16, all bets are off. I don't know, like, forget it. That would have been amazing. And if something like this had existed, that would have been amazing. But then we all have been like, what's a computer? So that's all I have. I just appreciate everything that you do, Kim. And I hope that some of the parents out there know that if your kids are kids, they need love more than anything else, more than labels. They just need love. So that's it. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Damien. That was really fabulous. Yeah, love your kids and trust your kids to be kids. I always say this: trust your kids to be kids. They're young. They're doing the best they can in a very tough world right now. It's a challenging time for our kids, but yeah, we've got a lot more resources than we did. You're absolutely right. Dr. Perez, did you want to jump in on anything before I go to some of the questions? And folks, please, let me just first say, please do submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A. We have a couple that came in ahead of time that I'll start to ask, but go ahead, Dr. Perez.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kim. Dr. Cray, Damien, amazing stories, just simply amazing. Thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing your journey with us. Really appreciate it. I do want to acknowledge that we have some members of our community, some members of our school board. Our superintendent, Dr. Yanni, is on the call, and he sent me a quick text to say how wonderful this was and how much we appreciate you sharing the story and being with us tonight. I am going to put myself on mute because the voice still isn't getting any better. And I don't want to be recorded too much longer with this lovely voice standing out there. So I'll turn it back over to you, Kim.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so I love this question. It's the second question for those of you who got them ahead of time. How do you best support a child who's using one name at school and still uses their birth name at home? Are they trying it out? We don't know the answer to that, but Dr. Cray, would you like to jump on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll often see things like this where, depending on the level of safety that a child feels, they'll use different names or different pronouns. Because, in some home environments, it's just not a safe place or an affirming place to use they, them pronouns or to use your affirmed name. So school might be a different story, right? And we want to make sure in situations like that we don't inadvertently out the student to the parents, because what we know is that LGBTQIA plus youth are already at a higher risk for suicidality in general, up to about 5 times. And that disruption to a home environment, it's not guaranteed, but sometimes best to play it safe. It can result in displacement, disenfranchisement, or worse. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons why we see a disproportionately large LGBTQIA plus homelessness population. So what I recommend is definitely following the student's lead, right? And offer that affirmation, right? Use the pronouns, and pronouns are hard, y'all. I'm not going to deny that. Like, getting used to using new pronouns, like, it's tricky. I struggle with it. I misgender myself all the time, right? But I'm always trying, and like that good faith effort of just mindfully correcting and moving on, like, students will notice that and they can feel really affirmed by that, right? But in terms of support, I say affirmation at school, definitely, and just caution when it comes to parental contact. It's not about keeping the parents in the dark, but it's about, protecting the child from a potentially really, really invalidating environment.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a question about helping your child to deal with a question about their identity and not fitting in. And I suppose this could be about any kind of identity and not feeling that they fit in. And I think about some kids who, because it was presented to them in a way, whether it's athleticism or a musical instrument, you're going to be in choir, or you're going to be in the band, you're going to be this, or whether we're talking about the LGBTQ2I plus population, when they have that identity, but they just don't feel like they fit in. How do we help kids navigate that, do you think? Dr. Craig?
Yeah. So senses of belonging are so important, right? Because no one wants to feel like the other. No one wants to feel like the outsider. The bills that Damien mentioned, like in Texas and Florida, they have that othering effect, right? And that can really exacerbate this sense of not belonging. So some things we can do is, if we're in a position, we can lead with lived experience, right? When I came out at my university, several students came to my office hours and were like, I'm so glad I feel safe talking to you about this now. And they felt connected, right? So if you're in a social position where you can be open about your own identity, that can be really transformative for kids, feeling that sense of belonging. Making sure that materials, that your students are represented in the materials that you're teaching, right? In videos you watch, in assignments you craft, just making sure, like, notice what groups are absent from those, and then notice if any of the kids you're working with are in those groups, right? Because sometimes just seeing something that makes you think of yourself in an assignment or in a required reading can be really, really transformative. Sometimes not belonging is the result, that feeling of not belonging is the result of people like actively invalidating you, like bullying. And I definitely have had my share of that. And what I tell other people and what I tell myself these days is that absolutely no one can actually succeed in invalidating you. It's impossible, because your identity is real. It's valid. It's yours. You are the authority on it. Other people can try to invalidate you, but they will fail. And that's kind of a them problem. They will try to invalidate, but that's them choosing error. They can say the moon is green too. They can say that grass is made of cheese, right? If they want to be wrong, cool, but that does not affect who you are, because you're the expert on that. So just some thoughts there.
Yeah. And I think too, when parents really struggle with, and I've gone through a few different things with my kids and their lives, and just what I always go back to is the fear that comes up for me, the fear I'm going to say the wrong thing, the fear that they're in pain and I'm not going to be able to fix them, right? Because of course I want to immediately fix my child if they're in some kind of pain. And so what I've learned through the last 12 years of doing these kinds of programs and working with families who are in this kind of pain sometimes themselves is that very challenging practice of just listening, and being mindful of our body language when we're listening, and not doing this when we're listening, because that's projecting, like, stop talking because you're freaking me out, or doing this, crossing our arms, or what, just even the act of breathing while you're listening, so that you're not panicking. We want communication to keep going. We want to not be judgmental. We want to help you as my child to feel that anything you say, I'm going to hear it. I'm going to digest it. I'm going to thoughtfully respond, not react, and it's a tough order. And God knows there are a lot of things I didn't do right as a parent, but I have to tell you that one of my proudest moments was when my daughter posted on Facebook. My daughter is gay. And when she posted on Facebook or Instagram or something like that a couple of years ago on coming out day, she said, I never had to come out because we talked about this my whole life, and I got that one right. I mean, she just said, like, I talked to my mom about this from the time I was really little. And she just said, like, you'll figure it out. I'm like, did I say that? Like, I think we overthink this stuff. That one didn't freak me out as much as my son and the drugs, frankly. That was a lot harder because in my mind, there was more stigma with that. And there was more fear with that, for sure. But in either case, it's very hard to respond appropriately and know that you're not contributing to their angst or the challenges that they're going through. So I just want to say I get it, parents, this is not easy to navigate. It really isn't.
I love that answer though, Kim, this listening, because like one thing I would always recommend is, if a kid comes and says, I identify as this, or I use this pronoun, there can be this initial resistance that's coming from confusion. But a fantastic question is, what does that mean to you? Or how did you arrive at that? What does it feel like for you when someone calls you that? Right? Because so many of our kids are constantly told they're not real. That if we give them a chance to tell their story a little bit and talk about what this means to them, that can be so deeply validating. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Damien, any thoughts on what it was like for you with family?
Well, it was interesting that you talked about your daughter, because it was one of those things with my family, like it was never really needed to be said kind of thing, because it was just like nobody questioned it. And when my brother, it's so funny. My older brother is gay, and he and his partner got married, but like they didn't even make a big deal of it. They went to like the courthouse, and they told us at like Christmas, and my dad, who's the only one left with us, he was so angry because he was like, I was so cute because it was almost like he took the mom role, whereas like he felt robbed of being able to throw them something. So it was one of those things of like, if a kid or even like a young adult is going through this, like just not say no. Like Dr. Cray said, like we're the expert on who we are, or who we feel. So like nobody, if somebody tells you that you're wrong, especially when you're coming from a place of fear already, if there's any sign of that resistance or that, that negativity, I would take it as I'm wrong, I'm broken, I need to be fixed, or I need to deny this. And then, helping them fit in is as simple as like, it can be as simple as treating it like it's not a thing, that just let them be. A friend, his child is non-binary and went through that very awkward phase with the family, learning the pronouns, but the transparency that they all maintained was beautiful to watch. The stumbling of going back to the original pronoun and then correcting themselves and letting their child be a child, but with their own parameters was astounding. And it's always like the parents that you never expect. Like it's always these parents that shock me that they have this capacity, and helping them fit in is just making more space for them.
Right. So true. That's very well said. I see that someone has their hand raised. If anyone has a question, I would ask if you could possibly put your question in the chat or the Q&A. since we're not able to hear you. But we do have another question about someone who is showing signs of social withdrawal and isolation, but is not able to articulate how they feel. Dr. Cray, do you have any tips for how to encourage conversation, difficult conversation when you're seeing those kinds of signs of isolation?
Yeah. So, in the context of like LGBTQI plus identities, a lot of times, like when we're asking people how they feel, about their identity, we expect them to have a well thought out analytical answer of what it means for them. That almost never happens. I can work with a group of non-binary students and ask them all to explain what that means, and they'll all give me different explanations that just wrap around and go in circles, and they're at the end, they're like, I don't even know, it's just how I feel. And I think normalizing the fact that our feelings can be valid even if we can't explain them, and that applies outside of LGBTQI plus identities too. Feelings are messy, right? Trying to put feelings into words without loss of information is like trying to hold on to a handful of sand. The more you try, the more it's just going to squeeze out through your fingertips. So if we can cultivate an environment where we hold space for feelings and we encourage people to feel what they feel, right? And not have to justify what they feel, and understand that it's okay to have a feeling even if you don't know what that feeling is, or it's okay to have a feeling even if you don't know why you have it, or you don't know what kind of feeling it is. And that's another way that we can also lead by example and model that behavior. We can, if we're talking about our own feelings to kids, we can sometimes make clear when it's like, I have no idea what this feeling is, but it's definitely a challenge right now. I'm not sure how to put it. This is what I need. This is the kind of space. If we can model that, then they can inherit those kinds of behaviors. Yeah.
How do you feel about, I've heard some other clinicians recommend this, sort of just like leaving out a notepad or something on the kitchen table that asks a question about your day, and like just leaving a pen there for your child to, or it could be a more pointed question. What do you think about that?
I love that. Yeah. Makes me want to get a roommate, so someone would do that for me. Yeah. And that could even just be like on your dry erase board on the fridge or something too, a question of the day, or something like that could be really good just to get those lines of communication going, because sometimes it's easier to write stuff down than it is to say it face to face, eye to eye, and you can think more about your response when you write it down.
Right.
You could even draw a picture.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something that's come up too. Like just to even, I've been noticing that, from the parents' perspective, like I've been noticing that, whatever the behavior is that you're concerned about, if anything you'd like to share with me, you can put it here, or something like that. Or don't forget, folks, therapy is not punishment. Therapy is there because even if we have a million initials after our names, which I sure don't, we are not capable as parents of, we wouldn't homeschool any other health condition, anything else. I always say this, like, why did we not take our son to see someone who understood drug addiction? Because we weren't ready to call it that. Instead, we took him to somebody who completely misdiagnosed him, who completely threw, sand over our heads and said, put your head back in the sand. He doesn't have a drug problem, because she didn't understand addiction. Why was I afraid to take him to a specialist who could understand what was happening to him? And so the same goes for challenges, find someone if you can. I know that we're limited resources, of course, but anyone who can understand the challenges that you're seeing specifically is really important. Look for those specialized areas of care, which leads me to another question that was asked. What mental health and behavioral health supports are needed for students who the supports are difficult to find? So, and I would ask Dr. Perez if she would like to jump in as well, just to say like what does Upper Dublin offer, but also what is out there and what is there not enough of. Any kind of guidance for parents, for families, educators who are with us about finding these resources.
Sure. So each of our schools has school counselors who who are available to our students to help them with a variety of matters. So that's what, they're there for. While we can't refer necessarily to outside agencies, there are outside agencies that could be available as well.
And our organization can refer to outside agencies. So please don't hesitate to contact us as well, our organization. I can put my contact info in the chat, particularly if you're looking for resources around substance use challenges and a lot of mental health challenges as well. We are very fortunate to work with a very large network of treatment providers, inpatient, outpatient, all kinds of programs that are out there. So don't hesitate to ask for that kind of support. And Dr. Cray, what are your thoughts about that? Like, what is still missing out there in we don't have universal health in this country. How do we help families?
I think one of the best support systems we can offer is just community and connection, especially for clients who are feeling that lack of belonging. If we can find a way to create and cultivate these communities where kids really feel safe, and that's harder in a pandemic or post-pandemic world, because so much of our contact for a lot of things over the last couple of years has been over Zoom. And it's really hard to feel that sort of tactile, like energetic personal connection with another person. It's hard to feel like you belong sometimes over Zoom. All right. But if we can build community organizations, like a kickball league, just something where a kid can go and have some autonomy and have a self, and have that self be the self that they want to show, and have that self that they want to show be seen by others, that can be so deeply transformative.
Awesome. The great question that just came in. This is for anyone on the panel who wants to comment. Do you feel hopeful that the generational progress of acceptance in our Gen Z population, that our society would be more inclusive sooner rather than later? How are you feeling? I know you've both commented that things are better now than they were back in the day, but are we where we want to be? How do you guys feel? Go ahead, Damien.
So, all right. So, in my work, I deal with a lot of television programming. And, when I was in high school, it was a very special episode if a character came out as gay or had a drink or drug problem. Today, the programming that I'm watching, the content that I'm seeing, it's, we went through that phase of like the gay character was no longer the tragic one, but then they became the sassy best friend, and then they became the series leads. Now we're seeing just regular inclusion of gay and lesbian characters. There are more trans characters on television right now that are they're not the trans character. Their character is being played by trans actors. And it is part of their character's arc, but it's not the arc of them. Shows like Euphoria, which is probably a horror movie for parents. If this was like a documentary, we're doomed. But there's like a ton of representation out there for kids to attach themselves to see they exist, they are seen, they are viable characters in important stories, they're funny characters, they're flawed characters, they're not just like the killers or the killed, and just like characters on various ends of the spectrum of sexuality are, it's no longer heralded by an advertising campaign. It's just a story is told. And that character happens to like boys and girls, and it's really been interesting to watch, because it was a long road for gays and lesbians to become, central characters. But then when that happens, suddenly like all of the other alphabet, it's been a much steadier like rise, and that's amazing to me. That like you can turn on so many different television shows right now and see so many different representations. That it's no longer just single white females. It's not just cisgender white guys. It's so many different colors of the rainbow, really, and I love it. And yeah, I'm such a fan of what TV is doing right now because they finally got it. And with younger actors, younger content creators, because of social media, finding their way into the industries, I do feel like the next wave will come faster and will be far more inclusive because they will create the things that they want to see. And like and Hollywood needs to watch out because these young kids are coming for their jobs, and I'm about it. I'm here for it. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I would second everything that Damien just said. I'm really hopeful for the future. There's a sense in which it's the best time ever to be an LGBTQI plus person in the United States. There's also a sense in which, it's also a sense in which it's the worst time. So when we look at, say, 2021 was the most lethal year on record for transgender persons. With about just over 90% of those killed via homicide were trans women or trans feminine folk, and about 80% were trans people of color. Right? But at the same time, the availability of care, the affirmation, the fluency in the concepts, the representation on television, and Gen Z are a bunch of little activists. And I'm here for it. And I think we see this exponential progress right now because communication and story sharing has become so much easier. Mm-hmm. Right? Our ability to share and empathize and learn about each other and about other cultures and about history, digital natives have a leg up over any past generation on that sort of information. Right? One thing that I really like to emphasize is, Damien mentioned the Texas bill and the Florida bill. And I'll tell you, the air is thick here in Texas right now. As a trans person who works in a system, that is part of gender affirming care, these bills are, well, let's not call Abbott's thing a bill. It was a letter and it's not legally binding. It has no legal effect. But it does make things uncomfortable. But what I try to tell people to reassure them is, this is evidence that we're winning. We wouldn't be receiving this level of pushback if we weren't making significant progress. If we were making no progress, there would be no pushback because there'd be nothing to push back against. So when I see this stuff, I feel in a roundabout way heartened. Not fully, because it's obviously tragic and going to have some very, very sad results. But it's also a sign that socially we're moving forward. And I feel good about that.
Well, we have two amazing role models with us tonight, and it gives me a lot of hope. I'll tell you that for sure. I'm glad you're both joining us and with this group tonight. I'm going to invite Dr. Perez to share any final words, but I just want to remind everyone to please complete the survey when this program ends. I really, really sincerely thank Dr. Cray and Damien and Dr. Perez and Michelle Boaz and Bob and Dr. Yanni for being with us. And that follow-up page with this recording and the slide deck and all that will be available tomorrow morning on that page that we slid you conversation. Thanks, Bob, for putting it out there again. Okay, Dr. Perez.
Thank you, Kim. Again, thank you, Dr. Cray, Damien, for sharing your stories, Bob, for helping with getting those links into the chat. And of course, to the Upper Dublin Education Foundation for financially supporting us bringing this event and the next two events to you. There were so many amazing moments. I have a whole page of different quotes and phrases that I heard that I want to be able to use again. But probably the favorite one right now is, you're the expert of your own identity. And I think that just says a lot. And I think that's something really easy that we can use to work to support our kids. So I really appreciate all of you. And again, your willingness to come and be with us and tell your story. Thank you.